it makes the conversation of fatigue even that more relevant to me, because you're always attempting, first of all, you're always attempting to tinker, but it's like, if we can't define what fatigue is, I think, it's at some point the body, like if I don't eat for 6 months, I'm not going to even come close to that. Like, I'm going to die. But there are people, these crazy stories, these crazy anecdotes of people surviving months without food. And it's like, was there a precipitating factor? Was there a motivation behind it? Or there's all these different factors. So it's like fatigue to a point, you can always, like, physiologically on a biological level, you can impose enough stress to break somebody at some point. So fatigue becomes more of a performance fatigue, one-on-one kind of factor there. But especially in powerlifting and barbell sports in general, we're probably not getting to that point much often. But then there's these other factors of motivation, boredom, because you can be bored with the exercises, but you can also be motivated and kind of push through that boredom. If you know that I've got a meet coming up and I'm doing these exercises, like, I'm not having fun training, but this is practice. I'm going to have fun at the meet. But you can be motivated, but just hate the training. It's like, I love powerlifting, but I'm so sick of these fucking exercises.
Right.
And that's just this conglomeration of factors that maybe fatigue is just a proxy for all of these things. And you're trying to gauge one or the other. And if you tinker with one, maybe that pushes you another microcycle or so. And if you find that no matter how you spin it, the athlete's telling you that they feel broken, you're seeing performance also, and you're just the way that you're talking to them, wellness questionnaires, there's all these factors contribute to you saying, all right, time to pivot.
Yeah. Well, there's kind of this uncoupling, at least to me, that happens between, if we can define fatigue just for a minute as, the athlete's perception of their own recovery status, their own healing, something like that. There's an uncoupling that happens between that and performance with this type of model, because in the beginning of a development cycle, they feel great. Usually they're coming off of the pivot, they're motivated, they're feeling rested, but performance is at its worst. At the end of the block, a lot of times they're feeling beat up, they're feeling not the greatest, they've gone through an entire development block, but that's where their performance is at its best, And if you use that for planning your time into competition at that point, say, okay, you peak in 6 exposures, so you put the competition on the 6th exposure, reliably performance will be at a peak on that competition day, and you work backwards from there. Okay, that's great. Performance will be at a peak. The athlete will also feel crappy, Now, if you can get everybody okay with that, I think it works just fine, because the thing you care about is the performance. Like, you just smoke some PRs on the platform. I don't really care that, it didn't feel good when I did it, right? I would rather have the PRs. You can feel good later. But it also has the potential to make athletes really nervous, because that's really unusual. Usually we want to feel good and rested, and it breaks down what we think of as the taper into competition.
That's another mind fuck, and not just for the coach, for the athlete too. The traditional taper is so interesting, because you expect, it's like, okay, just let me get to the taper. Our athletes, we're starting to shift a lot of our models as well, but some of them are still on kind of traditional blocks, and they're always, I just want to get to the taper, just get to the taper, just get to the taper. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to feel better. And now we've tapered your training. So you, in effect, have become slightly deconditioned. Like, we're hoping that your fitness level maintains and your fatigue decays. That's what the textbook tells us. But that may not be the case. And you could still feel like shit.
Right.
It's the peaking and the taper that I think are your emerging strategies. Seems so different. But those are also the time periods that seem the most confusing, because of how we're trying to box in a complex system like the human body into this this model that's supposed to be predictive?
So, a year or so ago, I think about a year ago, I sat down with some other guys, and I was asking for criticism of this idea, because for a while it makes me really nervous if I don't see the weaknesses of an idea, because all ideas have them, and if you don't see them, they're still there, right? So I was wanting to get some feedback and for people to honestly make some criticisms of this. And one of the criticisms that Bryce Lewis suggested was this idea of tapering, or kind of the non-taper. So just to be a little bit more clear, the way that I would do it kind of at a baseline is just kind of what I said before. So let's say you peak on the 6th exposure. So you put that on the competition day and you work backwards. So training is normal going into the competition. The week before the meet, you do normal training sessions. The only difference is you might rest for 2 or 3 days prior to competing, just so that you're not fresh off a training session. Like, that's
Mini
a
taper.
bit too much.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's like compressing that taper into an extremely short period of time. Right. His criticism was maybe you could apply the same type of thinking. Like, there's all this thinking around optimizing the development cycle so that it produces a peak result for the athlete. You could apply that same type of thinking to a taper strategy as well. What taper strategy can I do that's going to produce a peak result for the athlete? Maybe it's higher volume or lower volume or whatever. And I think that's valid. I think it's probably a good place to start to do this kind of non-taper approach, because it's going to reliably lead to a peak condition. It may not be the very highest peak that's achievable, but it's a peak, and that's something, And then from there, you can maybe tweak it, modify it, maybe reduce some of the volume, or maybe change something. It's time to get creative at that point.
Well, and the hardest part with that is when you say the highest peak possible, how realistic is that really? Like, it's such a moving target.
Yeah. Well, the difference between, like, what if you could look at your crystal ball and say, approach A is going to lead to a slightly lower peak, but a higher probability of hitting it. Approach B is potentially a bigger peak, but a lower probability of hitting it. Like, that's probably what you're dealing with,
I was going to say, how many traditional tapers where you feel like Superman, how many times does that happen? And versus that same person going through traditional tapers and kind of shit in the bed where they actually peaked maybe a month early, and on game day they didn't hit those numbers. It's almost a chance game.
That's been my experience. You have people that show up to competition and go, man, I was feeling really great the week before this. I don't know what happened. They're a week out, and then all of a sudden the bottom falls out of their training, and you're just kind of pulling your hair out like, I don't know what happened. Well, I think really what this is just kind of monitoring how long does it take for the bottom to fall out of it. Well, let's make sure that doesn't happen right before the competition. Let's shift some things around using that knowledge that you've gained.
What's interesting is even if you, let's say you are a week off, because that sometimes those time to peak can fluctuate based on, and maybe the fact that the anticipation of the meet, the anxiety of that makes them peak a week early.
Yeah.
But if they're still going to be fit, they're still going to be at somewhere on a bell curve. Let's say peak is peak, but you're still going to be a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. But that's still pretty high up as far as a fitness standpoint. Versus tapering, it's almost like it's either all or nothing. Like, people can really shit the bed sometimes.
Yeah, like if you've been, like you say, like you're reducing your training. And if you've been doing that for a month leading up to this, and now the bottom falls out of it, where do you go from there? Whereas if you've been maintaining things pretty normally, if I have an athlete that, they've peaked a week before I expected them to, and now they're a few days, a week out from competition, and, it's looking like things are on the downward slide. Well, I have some options. I can reduce the training load. I can say, hey, those last 2 sessions we were planning to hit, like, let's only do warm-ups for those or something. Like, we can do something and try to maintain that. Whereas the other way, it's like, well, you've already shot your shot. You just kind of got to ride it in.